Milne.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise today to support the censure motion, which cites the fact that the current Attorney-General is unfit to hold the office. Mr Acting Deputy President, it is absolutely clear that the rule of law is fundamental in a democracy. If we don't uphold the rule of law, then we are descending into the kind of mess we've seen in other countries around the world. It is fundamental. And what is extraordinary here is we have a Conservative government which cloaks itself in the flag, which cloaks itself in rule and in law and order, in order to try to secure support in the community, are actually not Conservatives, but they are extremists in the way that they attack the institutions in our democracy. Now, this is a really important point, and the Attorney-General is at the heart of this. It is his job as Attorney-General to defend the institutions of justice in our democracy. It is his job to defend the rule of law and uphold the rule of law and the independence of statutory authorities. And instead of that, we have seen the Attorney-General complicit in the Prime Minister's attack on the independence of the Human Rights Commission and clearly an attempt to destroy its president. That is extremely serious in a democracy, as indeed the legal fraternity, in the letter of support that they released in January, said independent public office holders are an important part of modern democratic societies. Their task is to ensure accountability for abuses of power by government. Their capacity to perform this role depends on their independence and ability to act impartially, and that's precisely what we have had with the Human Rights Commission, and that's why the government doesn't like it. In fact, they are the independent umpire of the state. They are the ones who, and it is essential here that we do support the Human Rights Commission as upholding, as an independent statutory authority, the rule of law. And it's particularly important in the case of Australia because we are unique in our treatment of asylum seeker children. No other country mandates the closed and indefinite detention of children when they arrive on its shores. Unlike all other common law countries, Australia has no constitutional legislative Bill of Rights to enable our courts to protect children. The evidence documented in the report, and this is a direct quote from the President, Professor Gillian Triggs, the evidence documented in the report demonstrates unequivocally that prolonged detention of children leads to serious negative impacts on their mental and emotional health and development. This is supported by robust academic literature. It's also clear that the laws, policies and practices of Labor and coalition governments are in serious breach of the rights guaranteed by the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights also suggests in his opening address to the Human Rights Council that Australia's policy of offshore processing and turning back boats is leading to a chain of human rights violations. And it is that quote from Professor Triggs which tells you why Prime Minister Abbott and Attorney-General Brandis are determined to try to destroy the credibility of the President of the Human Rights Commission, because it is the only institution which is calling out both the former Labor government and this government in their treatment of children as being contrary to the law. Now, that is the job of the Human Rights Commission, to do just that. In fact, under the Act, it says the 1986 Australian Human Rights Commission Act gave it the right to, quote, for the purpose of the performance of its functions, hold an inquiry in such manner as it thinks fit. And that is exactly what it did in relation to the cruel treatment of children, and it called it out in no uncertain terms. And that is why the Attorney-General has set out to destroy the credibility of Professor Triggs and, in fact, the institution itself. But it didn't just start with the investigation into the detention of children. This government's attack on the Human Rights Commission started virtually the day after it was elected. If you go through the period of time since the election in 2013 until now, you find endless attacks on the Human Rights Commission. You find it there in the denial to allow them access to Nauru and Manus Island detention facilities. You see it when Professor Triggs stood up on Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act and was vilified, of course, by the Attorney-General as well, for the stand which now it seems the Prime Minister has reversed his position on 18C and now wants to strengthen that particular part of the Act. You also saw it with the refusal to reappoint the Disability Commissioner. We've seen it with the funding cuts to the Commission. And, of course, we've seen it in the Children in Detention inquiry. But we also saw it in relation to many other things, including a statement from the outgoing Disability Commissioner, where he stood up in the Press Club in July 2014. The then, as I said, Commissioner Graham Innes criticised the government's attack on the Human Rights Commission, its focus on anti-discrimination legislation to the detriment of promoting fundamental freedoms. He stated that the Human Rights Commission only administers anti-discrimination legislation and that a Charter of Rights should be passed if it wants those rights to be examined. And he went on to criticise the government's decision to appoint Tim Wilson when it was intending to cut the Human Rights Commission budget and force them to actually accommodate that salary within their existing allocations. Of course, the President criticised the government not only on immigration but went on the legacy caseload bill. There's a whole lot. Day after day, week after week, they gave a ruling on indefinite detention of mentally ill Aboriginal men in the Northern Territory. Week after week, the Commission was doing its work, upholding human rights, putting a light onto where the government was failing to uphold the law. And as a result, the fact is the government decided to do in the Human Rights Commission, and many people will have missed it because they were on holidays. But in January this year, there was a report in Rupert Murdoch's pamphlet, The Australian, and it stated that Coalition MPs were attempting to launch an inquiry into the timing of the Human Rights Commission inquiry into children in detention and investigate her for political bias while criticising the President on many other issues. So this had been a decision of government. Backbenchers had already started to talk to the Attorney-General's office about launching this. And why? Because he had the report on the detention of children in November. This was a concerted campaign across the summer, ratcheted up in January, and we've just heard Senator Abetz on the Bassick affair, which again completely misrepresents the Human Rights Commission to the point where we had lawyers, a whole lot of them in fact, 25 leading legal experts, come out and point out that the government's attack on the Human Rights Commission over that particular decision was disgraceful. It found, of course, that the Commission, while the Commission found that the government hadn't established that continued detention after completion of a sentence was necessary, and Professor Triggs herself made it clear that the government had the right to reject her findings if they were wrong in law. And I want to make this point. Professor Triggs gave the report on Bassick to the Attorney-General in June last year. He had 6 months to reject, on the basis of the law, her findings. He didn't. He said nothing because in law she is correct. But he didn't want to do that. He waited until the time had run out when he could actually do something about it, and then he in January, launched the public attacks and smear campaigns through the Australian newspaper. That is disgraceful. If Senator Abetz, if the Attorney-General had a reason in law, they had 6 months to do something about it, and they didn't, because Professor Triggs was right in law for what she had done, and that is her job as chair of the Human Rights Commission. And she is a highly regarded legal expert. So that brings me back to the point I'm making about the rule of law in Australia and the Attorney-General's failure to uphold the rule of law. And that is a real concern. It was reported at the weekend in a very interesting assessment of our current Prime Minister's behaviour. In a particularly interesting piece, Tony Abbott running from the law by David Marr, he says, "But when the law stands between him and a quick win, he shows contempt for its values, its customs and the part they play in national life." And the Attorney-General goes along with it. And that is absolutely the case. They made a decision that the Human Rights Commission, by upholding the law, is undermining the government because it is exposing an extremist government acting in the face of the law in the wrong way. And so instead of reflecting on the Human Rights Commission's findings and actually upholding the law, they made a decision to start going after the Human Rights Commission and, in particular, its president. They know as well as we do that the only way they could remove the Human Rights Commission president is for misbehaviour, for bankruptcy, for failure to disclose interests, or for mental or physical incapacity, and they had none of those. They had no way that they could then actually get rid of the person they wanted to get rid of. And what is her crime? Her crime is she stood up for the law and the rights of the disadvantaged and the rights of children in detention. And people around Australia get it. They get it, Mr Acting Deputy President. They get that children were being treated badly in detention under both Labor and Liberal governments, and they now see a disgraceful effort by the Prime Minister and the Attorney-General to do in Professor Triggs. And what is more, these matters have now been referred to the Federal Police, as indeed they should be referred to the Federal Police, because an offer of an alternative position on the basis of a promise or an undertaking to resign can only be seen as an inducement. And that is why it is now before the Federal Police to make a judgment and an investigation into that matter. But we as a parliament have to consider what is to be done. And it goes to much more fundamental issues than political partisanship. It goes to this fundamental issue is, do we want as a country to allow the government to get away with undermining the rule of law? And if you haven't got the rule of law, then you sink into a quagmire. And that is my concern here, that the Attorney-General has facilitated and is facilitating the Prime Minister in abusing the rule of law because it suits them to do so, because Professor Triggs, without fear or favour, and the Human Rights Commission will do as they are required to do under the law, and that is look at issues brought before them, look at the framework and the legal process in place and act accordingly. And that is why we should be supporting Professor Triggs, and we should be doing everything we can in this parliament to seek the upholding of the law. And I want to just come back to the fact that it took Senator Abetz all of his speech until the last 4 seconds. I think it should be noted he did not defend the Attorney-General until the last 4 seconds of his speech. They know, as this parliament knows, as the Australian community knows, that this is an unwarranted witch hunt against Professor Triggs and the Human Rights Commission. There is no other way that you can see it. And the bullying, the abuse, and it was outrageous. In January, day after day, week after week, in The Australian, out came these reports, to the point where I asked for an assessment of just how many reports had come out in The Australian over January as we had this leading up to the release of the report. So there was a strategic decision made by the government to go after Professor Triggs, starting with their attack on the 8th of January, where we had the Prime Minister. And that's why I link this to the Prime Minister. It is not just Senator Brandis, it is right back to the Prime Minister's office. On the 8th of January, Prime Minister Abbott questioned the President's judgment on John Bassick, and he went on and on and on subsequent to that, and that led into the article saying coalition MPs are attempting to launch an inquiry into the Children in Detention report and investigate her for political bias, and so it went on. So the Prime Minister started it on the 8th of January, knowing this report had to come out, deciding then that they would bring it out on the last possible moment they could in terms of the time frame and work up day after day their attacks. And I think one of the most cowardly and disgraceful things from my point of view is the fact that the Attorney-General, if he had a problem with the Bassick judgment of the Commission, had his statutory 6 months to do something about it. Why didn't he? Why didn't he? Why didn't the Prime Minister require him to do something about it if they thought there was something wrong with the judgment in law? And there isn't. That is what is so pathetic, and that is the contempt that they show for the law. They would rather go through the shock jocks and the Murdoch pamphlet to get out there and build a case rather than go back to the fundamentals of the law, as indeed the legal academics came out and said. If the government disagrees with the Commission, providing a reasoned explanation of why it considers the Commission's reasoning or conclusions to be wrong as a matter of law would be the most constructive way of contributing to the discussion of the important and sensitive issues involved in the case. In our view, the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission has carried out her duties under the Act with independence, impartiality and professionalism, and that was the judgment of leading academics in relation to the investigation into the Bassick case. And I want to also correct the record. At no stage did Professor Triggs say that he should just be released into the community at large. That is important. It's a complete lie and misrepresentation that the government goes on with. Now, I know that there is great disquiet in the Liberal Party about what the Prime Minister has done and the Attorney-General has done, and that is why those people are concerned, because I know that there are people who joined the Liberal Party because they thought they were Conservatives. They thought they actually believed in the rule of law and upholding the rule of law. They thought they actually believed in human rights. And instead of that, they've landed themselves up in a party of extremists who are prepared to ditch the law when the law stands between the government and a quick political win or anything else, and they will show absolute contempt for the law. And that's why I support and the Greens are supporting the censure motion against the Attorney-General. We do not believe he is fit to hold the office of Attorney-General. And not only that, his behaviour and that of his colleagues has demeaned the Senate and the Parliament. It was a disgrace, the inquisition that took place last week, the failure of the chair to properly chair the session to protect the witnesses, but that is a secondary matter to the fact that we have a government prepared to undermine the rule of law. It is time we had an Attorney-General who will do as an Attorney-General is supposed to do, and that is uphold public confidence in the law and legal institutions and stand by those legal institutions. It is a view that has been expressed, I know, within the Liberal Party, as was reported about Craig Lundy, for example, MP saying, why didn't you focus on what happened to the children in detention rather than go after the lawmaker whose job it is, to the law commissioner whose job it is to interpret the framework of the law. The Attorney-General has shown he is not fit to hold the position he currently holds in the government, and that lack of confidence extends well into the community.